In July 1954, the First Indochina War ended with the signing of the Geneva Accords. French Indochina was dissolved, and Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos were granted their independences. In Vietnam, two rival states existed, the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, or DRV, and the State of Vietnam. Consequently, the Geneva Accords partitioned Vietnam into two military zones separated by a demilitarized zone near the 17th parallel, with the northern zone assigned to the DRV and the southern zone to the State of Vietnam. The partition was not a territorial boundary, and Vietnam was to be reunified after nationwide elections would be held in July 1956. However, the Cold War was underway and Vietnam consequently became a major battleground. The socialist DRV, which was commonly known as North Vietnam, backed by the Soviet Union, China, and other communist countries, and the State of Vietnam, later Republic of Vietnam, commonly known as South Vietnam, backed mainly by the United States as well as other democratic countries. In the north, the DRV, led by Ho Chi Minh, consolidated power, nationalized all lands and industries, implemented agrarian reform, and suppressed all forms of opposition. In the south, following a referendum in October 1955, the State of Vietnam was dissolved and superseded by the Republic of Vietnam, with Ngo Dinh Diem as president. Diem's government was marred by corruption, and Diem himself ruled with authoritarian powers. By 1957, because of Diem's repressive policies, a communist insurgency had emerged in South Vietnam, whose members the Saigon government called Viet Cong. Then in 1959, North Vietnam, frustrated at the failure of reunification elections and in response to the growing insurgency in the South, announced that it was resuming armed struggle to liberate the South and reunify Vietnam. North Vietnam agreed to provide military support to the Viet Cong, and in May 1959, it established a supply route to South Vietnam called the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which passed through eastern Laos and Cambodia. Soon, large quantities of weapons and supplies were being transported to the Viet Cong in South Vietnam. At the request of President Diem, the United States provided military assistance due to the deteriorating security situation in South Vietnam. American involvement in Vietnam had begun in 1950 when it provided military assistance to France in the First Indochina War. American involvement predicated on the Truman Doctrine, that of containing the perceived threat of global communist expansionism by the Soviet Union, and on the domino theory, that is, communist expansionism would cause Asian countries to fall to communism one after the other. Gradually increasing U.S. military assistance would occur with the administrations of Presidents Dwight D. Eisenhower, John F. Kennedy, and Lyndon B. Johnson. By 1963, South Vietnam was verging on collapse, with widespread protests and demonstrations in Saigon aimed at Diem's repressive, graft-ridden government. In November 1963, with American tacit approval, a military coup overthrew Diem, and the junta of top military officers was installed to rule the country. A long period of instability would persist with frequent changes in the ruling junta until 1967 when Nguyen Van Thieu would prevail in presidential elections. Thereafter, Thieu consolidated power and ruled with autocratic powers. Meanwhile, by 1964, the Viet Cong had expanded considerably, controlling nearly 50% of South Vietnam's land area and its 100,000 fighters engaging government forces in pitched battles. With the South Vietnamese military plagued by corruption and suffering low morale and poor combat capability, President Johnson was convinced that South Vietnam would fall to the Viet Cong. Then in August 1964, in separate instances, two American electronic spy ships operating off the North Vietnamese coast reported being attacked by North Vietnamese torpedo boats. These incidents would have far-reaching consequences as U.S. Congress immediately passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which gave President Johnson the authority to go to war against North Vietnam without first gaining congressional approval. Meanwhile, North Vietnam saw the Gulf of Tonkin incident as the pretext by the United States to directly intervene in the war and worse, to invade North Vietnam. Consequently, in early 1965, North Vietnamese forces and the Viet Cong launched attacks all across South Vietnam aimed at overthrowing the Saigon government before the Americans could intervene. The United States then increased its air attacks on North Vietnam and the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which would continue non-stop until 1968. American bases in South Vietnam then became the target of Viet Cong retaliatory attacks. To protect these bases, in March 1965, 3,500 U.S. Marines arrived, marking the first American combat troops to be deployed in Vietnam. Some 55,000 troops arrived the next month, also tasked only to protect American military installations. In May 1965, North Vietnamese forces and the Viet Cong launched major offensives in South Vietnam. American and South Vietnamese forces repelled these attacks, with U.S. air firepower being particularly decisive and the danger to South Vietnam passed. But this attack prompted President Johnson to send more combat troops, which reached 184,000 by 1965. More crucially, U.S. forces were now tasked to carry out preemptive combat missions in line with American military doctrine to take the war to the enemy. Even so, for President Johnson, the United States was to engage only in a limited war because of the risk of China intervening directly for North Vietnam, or worse, that America's distraction in Asia might prompt the Soviet Union to invade Western Europe. Thus, U.S. ground forces were not to invade North Vietnam but be limited to operating in South Vietnam, where nearly all of the fighting took place. At this point, the U.S. military took direct command of the war, with the South Vietnamese army relegated to a supporting role. U.S. military operations focused on major Viet Cong areas using the so-called search and destroy missions and air assault offensives, which have become iconic in photographs and films of the war. Major battles were also fought inside or near the DMZ. Then on January 31, 1968, the Viet Cong launched the Tet Offensive, a series of coordinated attacks on Saigon, 36 of the 44 provincial capitals, and over 100 other towns across South Vietnam. Only with the greatest effort did the American and South Vietnamese forces repel these attacks. However, in the United States, the Tet Offensive marked a turning point as American public opinion turned sharply against the war and a fierce anti-war movement emerged, particularly since government and military officials had stated that American victory was imminent. Tet also ended President Johnson's political career, and in a nationwide broadcast, he announced that he would not seek re-election as president. Then in 1968, President Johnson announced a dramatic reversal of American policy in the war. The U.S. military would henceforth gradually withdraw from Vietnam, and the South Vietnamese military would gradually take over the fighting. In January 1969, Richard Nixon succeeded as U.S. President and continued the policy of American disengagement and troop withdrawal from Vietnam. American public outrage was fueled further when in June 1971, the New York Times published the Pentagon Papers that showed that successive administrations had many times misled the American people regarding U.S. involvement in Vietnam. On January 27, 1973, representatives from North Vietnam, South Vietnam, the Viet Cong, and the United States signed the Paris Peace Accords, which ostensibly marked the end of the war. 1 year earlier, the United States dramatically began the process of improving relations with China and the Soviet Union after President Nixon's historic visits to Beijing and Moscow. For the United States, these events bolstered the end of its involvement in Vietnam. With the American withdrawal, South Vietnam's military situation rapidly deteriorated, leading to the quick and stunning end of the war. At the time the Paris Peace Accords were signed, North Vietnamese forces controlled a large section of eastern and northern South Vietnam. In 1973 to 1974, South Vietnamese forces launched inconclusive offensives to try and recapture these lost territories. In March to December 1974, North Vietnam launched its own counter-offensives. Then in March 1975, North Vietnam launched a powerful offensive that within a few days seized the northern half of South Vietnam, meeting only slight resistance from the South Vietnamese army as well as bringing shock to the international community. North Vietnam had planned this offensive only to gauge the American response. There was none, since by this time the United States was deeply immersed first by the Watergate scandal in 1973 to 1974, and then, after President Gerald Ford succeeded Nixon in August 1974, U.S. Congress rejected Ford's desperate pleas in March and April 1975 for military assistance to South Vietnam. North Vietnam, also surprised by its rapid gains, then made plans to capture Saigon by May 1, 1975. On April 19, 1975, North Vietnamese forces totaling 150,000 troops and backed by armored and artillery units attacked Xuan Loc, located 40 miles from Saigon. Resistance by the 18,000-man South Vietnamese garrison was fierce but fell after 2 weeks of bitter fighting. By April 27, 1975, some 130,000 North Vietnamese troops had encircled Saigon, with South Vietnamese forces verging on complete collapse, cohesion breaking down, and desertions widespread. Desperation and anarchy reigned, with the government's imposition of martial law failing to quell the panic-stricken population. The end came on April 30, 1975, when North Vietnamese forces entered Saigon with virtually no opposition, as the South Vietnamese command had ordered its troops to lay down their weapons. By early May 1975, the Mekong Delta south of Saigon also fell, bringing the end to the war.